City Club, and I welcome all of you, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Thank you for joining the City Club today on Friday, January 22nd for this week's Friday Forum. Today we will hear about why race still matters when we talk about sustainability and environmental justice. But first, some announcements. As always, in consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, I ask that anyone who has not already done so to please silence your cell phone. As always, we offer our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors, whose generous financial support make these time-honored City Club luncheons possible. Please join me in offering our appreciation to our winter quarter sponsors, Stoll Reeves, The Standard, and West Coast Bank. We greatly appreciate your support. If your company or firm would like to be a Friday Forum sponsor, please contact City Club staff at the back of the room or go to the City Club website. Next week, City Club members are invited to join author David Oates for a discussion about his book, What We Love Will Save Us, on January 25th at the Citizens Read event. You can learn more about this program and others on our website at pdxcityclub.org. At next week's Friday Forum, Professor Paul Apostolides will discuss the impact of immigration on America's labor force and food production. And now to today's program. Portland prides itself on its status as one of America's greenest cities, but the benefits of living in a sustainable city are not distributed equally among all residents. When compared with its white population, Portland's minorities tend to live in areas with poor air quality and higher asthma rates. Minorities are also more likely to live in neighborhoods where land is contaminated by past use or with less access to natural areas. Today we will hear how we might challenge the racial disparity in Portland and produce a genuinely more sustainable community for all. We welcome two speakers to the stage today. Professor Robin Morris Collin is the first law professor to teach sustainability in an American law school, which she does at Willamette University College of Law in Salem. She served as the founding chair of the legislatively created Oregon Environmental Justice Task Force and is a founding board member of the Environmental Justice Action Group of Portland, known as Lawyers for a Sustainable Future. She co-founded both the Conference Against Environmental Racism and the Sustainable Business Symposium. Her latest publication, co-authored with our other speaker and her husband, William Collin, is a 3-volume encyclopedia of sustainability that details issues relating to the environment, business, economics, equity, and fairness. In addition to co-authoring the aforementioned book, today's other speaker, Will Collin, joined the Center for Public Policy at Willamette University in 2003 as its senior research scholar. Previously, he was faculty member at the University of Oregon, where he began teaching environmental justice in 1993. There he developed courses on environmental justice, sustainable urban planning, and urban environmental impact assessment. He was among the first environmental justice appointments to the Environmental Protection Agency's advisory committees and was also one of the first expert witnesses on environmental justice in a federal court. With that, please help me welcome today's speakers, Robin Morris Collin and Will Collin.
Thank you, Sue. I appreciate that. And I'd also like to extend thanks to President Lee Pelton, Joe Bowersox, the Director for the Center of Sustainable Communities, and the Board of Trustees at Willamette University for tolerating us and helping us with our research. I'd also very much like to thank, wherever he is, the late Miles Brand, who hired us when we went to U of O, and Dr. Dan Udovic, who was the chair of the University of Oregon Environmental Studies when he had to handle me there. He was very protective. And to our many students that I see throughout the room, and to many EJ activists, and soon you'll learn who they are when I'm done talking to you today about that. Tonight, we share the podium to discuss environmental justice and sustainability.
We've prepared for you a short talk on the basics of environmental justice and sustainability and the unavoidable, inextricable link between them. We will address environmental justice, will address environmental justice, and I will be talking about sustainability and equity.
First, how did we get to where we are? That's very challenging. My students who know me well know that's a big question to ask me, so I will summarize it. For the listening audience who are taking notes at home, I will summarize it point by point at the end so you don't have to write furiously at home as I speak. First, 5 points. 200 years of unregulated industrial expansion and large increases in population growth before there was any regulation. The Environmental Protection Agency, I've written the only book on it, and I'm well aware of what they can and cannot do. To depoliticize the issue a little bit, it was formed under Nixon, and one of the best early EJ reports was under Administrator Riley, an appointee from first President Bush. There's limited authority with the EPA over some, but not all, environmental impacts. Environmental impact statements are advisory only. 92% of environmental impact statements in the state of Oregon are categorically excluded because it's been gutted by political decisions about what should be covered in terms of environmental impacts. And so there's leaks in the system from even before that. And the large and increasingly toxic waste stream, you may call it low-level radioactive waste, 11E2, low-level radioactive waste, has to go somewhere. And we fought it in the Midnight Mine with the Spokane, and I was an expert witness there, and Niemeyer Gold, the largest mining company in the world, withdrew the request for a permit to do that because they don't want us to be in that forum, and we will be. The waste went and goes to where people can least resist it. The United Church of Christ study held that race, not air quality, not water quality, not land condition, not geological condition, not political saliency, not anything except race determined to a 1 in 10,000 chance of it being random or 99% chance of it being wrong or being right, that race, and it was Africanity, the blacker the community, the more they were close to hazardous waste. Now there's a historical story there I can't get into now because of time, so suspend your judgment on the players. Third, land use. Don't hold your hopes on land use. Idea legally recognized in 1921, slowly adopted, and very seldom enforced. Let me give you the context for land use. Decades of unequal municipal services and housing and building codes, enforcement. Where you live determines where you go to school. Decades of unequal municipal services in education, in employment, fire, police, sanitation, parks, and recreation, as well as public works, all by racial composition of the neighborhood. You don't think there's going to be an ecological impact from a treatment of a community that's been so excluded? It's here today. They have all less toxic environmental pockets that corrupt any sincere attempt at ecological and equitable attempts at sustainability. 4, all environmental decisions are tinged with your perception of risk. And research in Oregon demonstrated white males viewed it as okay to place dangerous risk in communities without notice. And the more the education and income of those white males went up, the increasingly occurrence of that dynamic. 30% of, as the study said, non-white individuals found a higher perception of risk across 30 categories of risk. 30% of non-male, let's call them, to stick with the category of female perceptions of risk, were also high, across 30% higher than white males. So we have this aura of invincibility as a white male. It's our blind spot, like the movie. I'm going to hit on this theme. Our blind spot in sustainability is racism. So, moving quickly along, most environmental decision makers are white males. The risk model for what we determine what's risky is a 150-pound to 160-pound white male, not a vulnerable member of our population, and we are all vulnerable. We don't all come out like this. We get old, we get young, we're vulnerable. Institutional racism in environmental decision-making is a big cause of how we got here, how we stay here, and presents a substantial challenge to sustainability. Last contextual point. Environmental justice for those who strive for definitions, and I never give one out straightforward because I make people earn it, but generally is the disproportionate and sometimes adverse impact by race, income, and access to those decisions. Because of cumulative emissions and exposures and disproportionate impacts, because of scorecard.org, where we can find out what we breathe and what affects us, public health has become part of EJ and will be part of sustainability. Summarizing the last points, uncontrolled and controlled increasing waste streams, weak land use practices, institutional racism and environmental decision-making, the inclusion of public health in environmental decision-making, and an increased emphasis on sustainability all got us to where we are today.
These pose real challenges to sustainability. As Will has said, these challenges are often overlooked because we have a blind spot, that's the best way I can put it, a blind spot around racism. But let's talk a little bit more about sustainability. Sustainability is most often described in one of two or maybe both ways. First, it's often described in terms of the ability to meet our own needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. A different way of thinking about sustainability is in terms of three overlapping domains. The first is environment or ecology, economics, and the third is equity or fairness. Let's speak plainly about it, however. It's not that complicated. It just means that we cannot be so greedy that we take so much that future generations cannot meet their own needs. And we must leave them with at least as good as we have received. And even more to the point, when we fail to do that, when we blight our ecosystems, it's the equivalent of digging our own graves and then throwing our children in. Sustainability forces us to recognize the limits of our ecosystems and the limits that those ecosystems impose on economic activities and upon human lives. And the moment that we start talking about limits, we must also recognize very tough, uncompromisable distributional issues. Equity focuses on the future allocations of environmental benefits and burdens, and we have inherited a very unbalanced distribution of benefits and burdens. The problem with history is that it isn't over yet. The inequities that plague us today and the systems that threaten our survival today are largely the result of deliberate, intentional policy and law, and those past acts continue to affect present conditions. Those of you who are members of the City Club will remember, I'm sure, Marcus Mundy's delivery of the State of Black Oregon 2009, and some of you who are old enough might even remember the 1968 City Club report on the problems of racial justice in Portland. I challenge you to look at the two and to consider that we have not moved very far. The same kind of disparities are found at every level, and nationally they are footprints that lead directly back to the era of slavery. Slavery was an institution in this country for 244 of our formative years. It has not left its imprint unscathed in terms of our economy and our behavior. Globally, we need to think about a history of colonialism and post-colonial depredations. And part of the reason for the disparities that are now challenging not just sustainability in terms of economics, but human sustainability and all life sustainability, part of the reason for this disparities tends to be that we have maintained an intentional policy unintentionally. That is to say, all of these early policies of slavery and segregation were intentional. We have maintained them unintentionally, and they are creating holes in the bucket, so to speak. Unsustainable decisions about allocations of benefits and burdens discount the value of future lives. Let me explain in brief terms what I mean by that. When all the benefits come to us, and all of the known risks go to future generations, we are discounting the value of future generations. And that's why I said we're willing to throw our own children into our graves. When we discount the value of the lives of others, we take all the benefits and we dump all the risks and the burdens onto other people. We're doing exactly the same thing. The important point is not just that we are willing to sacrifice other people. It is our blind spot that we don't realize we're going to end up sacrificing ourselves by collapsing everything life depends upon. We do this often in public policy. When we create sacrifice zones out of communities and people who are not included and whose consent is not obtained. And this lack of inclusion and lack of consent are one of the most often raised environmental justice concerns about environmental decision-making. If it sounds familiar, it is. Exclusion and injustice were the same problems with racial segregation in housing, racial segregation in employment, racial segregation in access to public funding and public places. And while delay and defiance may have thwarted justice in those areas, the environment is not negotiable. It reflects all injustice from whatever source without regard to politics, wealth, or power. Sustainable decisions are ones that expand environmental public participation and share power. They require cultural competence in public outreach and implementation. We cannot be afraid to talk to each other, understanding that it won't always be a love fest. We have much in common, and the best conversations are had when we focus on what we have in common and not what our differences are. Sustainable decisions will require competence in the assessment of benefits and burdens, including body burdens for our most vulnerable and exposed populations, children, farm workers. These are the unavoidable issues, and they will arise in many new forums, including being in new places like the City Club today. Will tell you a little bit more about those new forums.
Thank you, Robin. I'm going to talk a little bit about how unavoidable environmental justice is because it's showing up in unavoidable forums. Most people would generally agree a Federal Circuit Court of Appeals that subpoenas you is a forum that's fairly unavoidable as a condition of non-imprisonment or a contempt citation. So environmental justice is a summation in many ways of cumulative discrimination in housing, education, employment, transportation, and are now reflected back at us as we soberly observe the brass tacks impacts of our impact on the ecology in our most oppressed, marginalized, and disenfranchised communities. All other areas I just discussed were kindly negotiated in our courts and governments and decisions like due deliberate speed for integration, little negotiations made and with well-intended people and laws not really enforced or sometimes enforced. That's not going to happen with the environment. It's not negotiable like that. You may negotiate with the human face of the person that claims to own the land, or the human face of the bank that owns the note, or the human face of the counselor that represents that area, but they're not the land. They're not the water. They're not that. And so that negotiation is specious, ephemeral. And so in nature, there are no sacrifice zones with healthy ecologies. There is no negotiated way out with our failed ecosystems. So there's a court case that came up within about 10 miles of here called Rosemere versus the Environmental Protection Agency. And it's a complicated case and time is short, and I'm not going to ask anyone to brief it for me right now, but this case shows you how are we handling these intractable, difficult decisions right now with a Federal Circuit Court of Opinion that said that the EPA has systemically ignored civil rights complaints for over 13 years. Our enforcement system for the environment is complaint-driven. You must embrace the complainers for environmental enforcement. And our cities are where most of the people live now, where most of the people of color are, and where most of the pollution is. So Rosemere simply said that the Environmental Protection Agency couldn't take so long, so it made the case moot. It couldn't self-moot or make irrelevant its own cases by being lazy about investigating them. They couldn't demur, they couldn't brush off the Rosemere community and its environmental justice complaint. The basis of that complaint is Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that was written by a very charismatic representative. There's a long story there, but said if you get federal money, you can't discriminate by race, and if you do, we want it back. And so, complicated court cases, Sandoval came up, no private right of action, the lawyers know what I mean with that, I can tell people later, but we still don't have that question answered, do we? There are 60 cases sitting in Region 10. There's an administrator that likes to stay in DC coming out here checking up on why Region 10 isn't doing great on EJ, and I just don't see any improvement. I see us as a marginalized state that's Seattle-centric. There's money around, it's in Seattle. I'll stay off that one because we need it for EJ here. So in the Rosemere case, they have to go back and decide, we don't know what. There's not any guidance. If you're an industry person with a permit application outstanding and you're trying to do right, you don't really know. All the stakeholders, as Robin was talking about, are disadvantaged by not figuring out how to get around an EJ issue. The Rosemere case and other cases like it I've been familiar with. I don't like to be in court. I don't like to have an adversarial process determine a result that lasts a lot longer than what we're talking about as humans. I personally view that, with 2 law degrees, I view that as unethical on it. And I think more and more people are doing that. I could go through the case, just simple one language that all you need to know is the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals on September 19th of this year held that the EPA failed to process a single complaint. A single complaint. So where's the enforcement and an enforcement-driven model for environmental protection when simply because of the nature of the complaint as it affects the environment, its civil rights, you just don't do anything with it on it. What to do with EJ? Unavoidable issues, unavoidable forums. The input from the most affected communities, the canaries in the coal mine, right? The most vulnerable populations is the basis, is the foundation of just the simple old model of environmental protection we've had since '71. But without embracing that input, and I mean embracing it, I don't mean tolerating, I don't mean saying hello, I mean embracing that, helping, capacity building, that input, the ability to plan for something as large and hard to define as sustainability is foundationally corrupted. So what can we do in Portland? That was one of our questions. And for those at home taking notes slowly, I will also summarize the points. Number 1, you already doing it. There are many decisions affecting environmental justice. Portland is trying hard to be sustainable. That's a wonderful energy for civic responsibility and many things. When Mayor Adams helps decrease coal-fired energy production, when mayoral candidate Chris Dudley speaks about diabetes to you right here, when Senator Wyden brokers a bitterly controversial timber sales environmental conservation arrangement in Eastern Oregon, when Attorney General Kroger puts an environmental crimes hotline on his webpage, when Outward Bound schools expose young adults to their natural limitations, because they don't really know all the time they have some, when fish and wildlife decisions are made, when children are the subjects of public policy, when bank loans are made to cover dirty land and mortgage companies want to make sure that if they go, that owner goes bankrupt, someone cleans the land up, and we still don't have an answer on that. There's a lot of law reviews though. When urban design decisions are made, these are all EJ decisions. When college curriculum is planned, That's an environmental justice decision. These are all decisions that engage in the distribution of environmental benefits and burden, and self-acknowledgement of that is your first step. That's what Portland can do, internal EJ analyses, so that people know where each other stands in terms of that. Recognize that what you already do affects that environment. Play to your inherent but unrecognized organizational strengths. I'll say that again. Your inherent but unrecognized organizational strengths around EJ. 2, justice is not a side order of sustainability. Let's be clear about that. We must first find what is just to do and then make that sustainable. Fundamentally unjust communities cannot be made sustainable by a magic wand. Balancing the environmental impacts across the community generally reduces them. There's a wonderful story about this I don't have time for in Los Angeles, where the incinerator modality of waste treatment was defeated by a self-described gap-toothed welfare mother of 5.
We have time.
Oh, okay. Sheila Cameron in LA, had an incinerator proposed. The representative, state rep, was an 83-year-old African-American man who had represented him for many years, and an industry I won't name came in and offered $1 million for a community center in the name of his late wife. And it would be some jobs. The community activist, Sheila, read the California version of the environmental impact statement. She has babies with asthma, and she said, well, we're not going to get this. And they didn't sue in court, and they didn't go to the legislature in San Francisco. All they said, if we get one, you get one. You understand? If we get one, you get one, San Bernardino. And that's very effective. And so we're in the world is like this room slowly getting smaller. So we can see who doesn't have one yet. People are aware of the burden more and more. There's no exit. It's epistemological uncertainty. We're just begging for the right questions to ask even on that. So what Sheila Cameron did is what we do in EJ all the time. We have many successes. Here in Portland with Jerry Sunville, Williams now, engaging in tough issues with all her time for no pay. So the point I'm sure my wife wants me to make is that we say if we get one, you get one, and no one got one. And no one got one. With that leveraging. Now, it's not like it's African-American NIMBYism. I want to be clear about that. It could be sometimes, but that's not the dynamic we're working with. 3, reparation to land and people for waste sinks, waste sites, and unequal provision of municipal services and cultural amenities. Brownfields, gray fields, port fields, all cleanup, all important issues. They should be cleaned up to residential levels, no matter what, I feel, because we care about people and I don't want to discount lives. But the fight is, it's cheaper and faster for economic development purposes to only clean it up to commercial standards. And when a community has nothing, and you're looking at nothing versus being stuck with dirty land, they'll take the dirty land, but that's not right. And that's not sustainable. And that's why justice becomes before sustainability. 4th, state, local, and federal land use processes. And I'm a big fan of the dirt. Charles Darwin's favorite animal was an earthworm, and so is mine. I just relate to dirt. I don't know what it is. And on that, but anytime you deal with it, it's probably the old farmer in me, but it has to be based on real and actual notice on the environmental decision with 2 things, with meaningful opportunity to learn as well as to participate. Because I could have the most knowledgeable lawyer in my environmental class and you wouldn't know anything. You need a place to learn. You need a space that's okay to have capacity building. You need a place where it's okay for women to bring their kids to a meeting and not have to sign a waiver on state liability. You need these places and spaces for this. And it's awkward because I've talked to regional federal agencies and other places where they do make some efforts, but they don't follow through. So you radio listeners with your notes and pens, play to your strengths. Play to your strengths on environmental justice. Prioritize justice, and then go for sustainability. Make cleanup a sustainable priority. make cleanup a sustainable priority, and increase meaningful public participation. And each of those, I can go on more and I'm not, but I'm going to work toward a conclusion. We've tried to do this in Oregon, and we've created, with many, many people before us and on whose shoulders we stand, the Environmental Justice Task Force. This is a tough task force. We passed a law. It's signed by the governor. And Robin was the founding chair of it. I currently chair it on it. And just to quickly let you know what we do, and I see Khalid in the back and other task force members. I don't know if John Ostar is here. We have quorum every time. No one gets paid anything. And we're in charge of 19 state natural resource agencies in terms of environmental justice, and they just about show up every time. I am very thankful for the natural resource agencies for helping my task force in environmental justice. So this year, quickly summarizing, and we're working with groups and we're trying to increase the capacity of communities in Oregon to apply for federal grants, but we began the development of a mapping project with Opal starting it. And we're trying to get environmental risk tied to human vulnerability, and then make the state agencies be aware of that in a permit. Now, it's only aware. It's not, if it's too risky, they say no, which I personally think it should be for that. You have to say no sometimes. Everyone in this room knows you have to say no sometimes. And the second thing we've done is a capacity building project on the web. All this is accessible via the Oregon Governor's webpage called Your Voice, and that's right on the web. And on March 10th, we're going to have an event at PSU so you can see your natural resource agency people and us and what we do, and sort of work more closely outside of being Salem-centric, but with the Portland, all of the Portland, you included, all the Portland community. Then thirdly, and this is more my approach at collaboration, because I think we get better ecological results by collaborating. Even when someone's told me no, I will still try to collaborate with that, is a cultural competency requirement in natural resource agencies for managerial advancement. If you want to be a manager and advanced up through the ranks of the agency, you should know environmental justices. One, because of downside risk in terms of legal liability through Title VI, but two, because it will help you prepare for the future emphasis internationally, statewide, nationally, and locally on sustainability. So this, I feel a bit awkward about this because cultural competency is a lot more than environmental justice, but it's not a cultural competency task force, it's an EJ task force. So they are happily moving along on this. It's not glamorous, but it's roll up your sleeves and do the work. So with that, for too long, as Robin was talking about, in public policy, we have had segregation in the concerns of people of color. It's not that you can't walk into the doors of Salem, it's just that the revenues doesn't go your way. The revenue streams don't come that way. They go to other groups that say they're doing what you're doing. It's very strange for us doing environmental justice and sustainability. And I have to, and why we agree to do these forums, I don't like doing these forums, and I don't ever do any forums on work that I write because it speaks for itself, but she co-authored it with me, and so I have to be here. So, but the public policy of sustainability is just, I have to sadly say, is setting itself up to segregate out the interests of people of color who are the most environmentally impacted. And the only way around it is to come to forums like that and speak to you about that, and for you to listen to Robin conclude.
We have had over 100 years of public policy that took account of race in very negative ways. And that history of taking race into account only when it is a disaster, or only when we want to exclude because of race or poverty, is a feature of failure that we've inherited from the 60s, most recently. The reason school desegregation in many ways didn't succeed was because, I think, the prospect of black and brown kids being the beneficiaries of education made us disinvest in public education. I worry about sustainability. I worry deeply about the effectiveness of this movement towards sustainability. And one of the worries that I have is what I observe as a kind of color line between environmental justice and sustainability. And the line isn't green. These movements are inseparable. They require us to transcend our difficulties. They require us to talk to one another and to resolve at last some of these intractable issues of racial oppression and the privilege that it is built on top of it. Race matters to sustainability. Poisoning communities and people of color create holes in the protection of the earth. Our human institutions of racial oppression make communities of color and people of color into these sacrifice zones. These sacrifice zones burn holes in the protective fabric of our earth. When we turn a blind side to the distributional impacts of these policies, and when we try to believe that our efforts can succeed without intentionally engaging the problems of race, what we do is not just to ensure our own failure, but we ensure that the earth that we all depend upon will suffer as well. I'd like to close with a couple of quotes from other people. The following words are often attributed to Chief Seattle, and I will footnote. There's a controversy about this attribution, but they're good words nevertheless. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons of the earth. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. I would add, whatever he does to the earth and other beings, he does to himself. And if you prefer, there is always Meditation 17 of John Donne. It starts, no man is an island. No man is an island entire of itself. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. With that, I'd like to close our portion of the remarks, and that gives us a healthy amount of time for questions.
The first question for our speakers, as always, will be from our City Club host. Our host today is Steve Rosenbaum. Steve serves as president and CEO of Pop Art, an interactive marketing agency. He serves on City Club's Finance Committee and is a member of the Board of Governors. Steve?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I knew our political system is broken in many ways, but I kind of feel overwhelmed. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's another way that our system's broken. And I feel like I'm doing what I can do to make the world a better place, but you know, I only have so much resources, I only have so much time. What am I supposed to do? Like we're all in this place. I think most people in this room are, you know, we're all fighting the good fight as much as we can, and as an individual, what can I do to make a difference?
I'm happy to take a first shot at this one. First, let's all acknowledge that we all feel overwhelmed. The fact is that the kinds of problems we're talking about are complicated, and they range from very small sorts of choices to very large systemic kinds of issues. And so one of the things that I would say that we all should do, is to do what is comfortable and easy first. Let's start there. And when you stop and think about it, there are a number of fairly comfortable, easy things that we can do at home, that we can do in our workplaces, that we can do in our fraternal organizations or at church or temple. Those are the things that are doable, and let's take the low-hanging fruit where we can. And when you open your eyes and ask, what can I do? It's amazing the things that you find. We can stop using plastic. Yeah, I think that's my personal, no plastic. But then there are the uncomfortable things, and I'd like to turn my attention for a moment to the uncomfortable things. What is it that makes us squirm? And often when we're talking about race and we're talking about poverty, we are really talking each in our own way about getting outside of our comfort zone. And so what I'd like to urge you to do is to take a deep breath. Breathing is really important. Take a deep breath and think about getting out of your comfort zone. Think about talking to other people, especially in your work. Think about where in work issues you might be able to talk to somebody of color, you might be able to talk to somebody poor if you knew them, and then find somebody. And if you can't, believe me, there are people in the room today who are more than willing to make that connection with you. And then I want to lastly say, let us commit to thinking about the parts of our system that systematically undermine sustainability and systematically create racial inequities. And the really tough part about this, and there are plenty of people in this very room who understand the system, I am asking all of you to think critically about how we can change the system so that it doesn't force us into unacceptable, unsustainable, and inequitable results on a daily basis. Will?
Yes, thank you, Robin. Thank you, Steve, for your question. This is a common problem in environmental studies. The deer in the headlight problem of the apocalyptic vision of scaring people to death on environmental issues. You die to, I tried to do everything. And so there's articles written about this. And it's a very difficult proposition if you're a young professor trying to get students in your course and scare them with environmental things. You might get some environmentalists, but do you want just environmentalists? We have these silos now where we just all talk to each other and we mutually congratulate each other and then nothing happens. So, you know, this self-recognition, the self-awareness that you showed, Steve, that I am overwhelmed. I am overwhelmed. You know, that's okay to be overwhelmed. With a lot of privileged groups where we haven't acknowledged our privilege, a sense of being overwhelmed is a very frightening thing to people. But if you're grown up, every day being in a recession, as many in the African American community do, then you deal with it a little bit differently. Secondly, self-empower through knowledge. Self-empower through knowledge. More than your MSDSs in your industry or your International Standards Organization 14001 form, but those are places to start. But educate yourself with that. The scorecard.org is a place to start on that. If you're going to buy a home, you should look at that. Thirdly,
wait. Oh. And don't forget to read our books. That's an excellent place to self-empower through knowledge.
Anyway. Where was I? Oh, sustainability causes. Thirdly, there's a lot of sustainability causes out there. Everyone's sustainable. Sustainable shampoo, sustainable show. It's an apple pie issue that's being glommed on because it can transcend big differences that currently exist in our society. But sustainability is a lot different in the Eastern and other places in the world that we might want to trade with, that we might need to manufacture goods and create services that require sustainability certifications, and they're going to come, their clients will be coming to you asking you to do that. So choose your sustainability causes carefully. Who is, everyone's on that. So, be discreet and look at them, and I look at them to be inclusionary. I want to make sure they're inclusionary, that it's not all my friends I play basketball with that have a beer on Friday. So, you know, the sustainability causes will, I'm sure, fill your mailboxes and emails, but be discerning. The last thing is simply the view of life. 70 years on Earth, you sleep a third of it, it takes a third to grow up, and we're sort of in the third doing this stuff. So we don't live that long, and our impact on the environment has to be measured beyond our narrow life frame. So if that helps lessen the overwhelmingness, and I've had a lot of experience doing that, that's helpful. The other cultures have a much different view of this, and one example, working with the Choctaw Band near Philadelphia, Mississippi on this, and we asked them some of these issues with this, and they included, in their view of life, all their ancestors, and they didn't count generations and anything like that, but that's their view of life. So whatever they did to the earth, as Chief Seattle's quote is. So when you grow up with that ethic, I can't take more than I give back. Whatever I do it. When you just grow up with that, you're not as overwhelmed. But when you never grow up with that, and all of a sudden it's like, I didn't know, epistemological uncertainty, that's what I claim. And on it, and it's true, it's a truth. But we have a view of life responsibility to not dig the graves of our children. We have a view of life responsibility that if we put off much more, as overwhelmed as you are now, your children will be even more overwhelmed. So we have to take the bull by the horns on this. And it's right at the precipice where change occurs. Right at the precipice where change occurs. Right at brinksmanship, outside of governmental forums, where change occurs. We're reaching the precipice. We can go a couple ways. I'm sorry, I didn't see questions there. Did you want to?
We'll now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forum is a privilege of City Club membership. When you ask your question, ask it in 30 seconds or less, and identify yourself as a City Club member.
Jeannie Crouch, City Club member. I have a policy question for you. As you probably know better than I, the National Environmental Policy Act requires that federal agencies address certain issues when they are evaluating a project. So they look at air and water pollution, they look at cultural resource impacts, they look at endangered species, environmental justice, and cumulative effects. They do that on projects on federal lands and on projects that they are permitting entities from the private sector to undertake activities. The National Environmental Policy Act does not apply to private sector projects as a general rule or as a general statement. So that is very, very different than most of the rest of the industrialized world. And the National Environmental Policy Act applies to planning, and so preparation for projects in advance, and when you might be able to mitigate some of the issues of environmental justice that you address. So my question is, should there be a change in our policies so that we are actually addressing these issues up front rather than EPA might do as an agency that basically counts parts per million and is more, has a bigger stick than it does a carrot?
I have a couple of broad responses first. NEPA is a great idea, the National Environmental Policy Act. It's a great model in terms of getting information out, but the problem is it's Swiss cheese in terms of who it applies to, and so it's largely ineffective, but it's a great model. Having said that, NEPA's at least trying to talk about environmental and ecological constructs. In the absence of something like NEPA, what we tend to have is what I would call real estate development. That is to say, when we don't have an environmental policy tool, what we tend to default to is a version of land use which is really about real estate interests. And as advanced as Oregon is in terms of its land use planning, since we don't have a state environmental policy act and we aren't doing that, I would maintain that what we have, for example, in this state is not environmental policy as much as real estate policy. That is a terrible blind spot. It is unsustainable. And when you look, that's the top layer of the disconnection. But you look beneath that and you see subsequent repetitions of this disconnection between environment, community, and real estate. And what we need to do is to rethink the connections, rethink the communication across those lines, because in the absence of it, we get one stakeholder, real estate, that is overrepresented in the decisions that affect our communities and that affect our environment.
I had a quick response to that too, and I know the Act very well, and the inspiration of NEPA you could read today, and it would apply to sustainability. The environmental assessment is done without any public notice. To get a finding of significant impact is difficult. I view it as co-opting some EJ communities. There's no requirement by law that you mitigate your mitigation, as there is in other countries, on it. So what I've done, and some of my students may be here in the classes, I made them do this, is do a MEPA, a Municipal Environmental Policy Act. No thresholds, everyone's covered, cumulative risk, you look at those pockets. No federal courthouses cutting out the gas station so they could avoid an EIS requirement, as occurred in Eugene, on that, and focusing on vulnerability. But we're stuck, and I could go more on it, on this sort of antiquated 70s compromise between industry and environment, neither trusting each other, that both are untruthful and seldom kicks in as a mechanism to handle many of our environmental impacts. And I think a major revision of that is necessary, but before that, we need SEPA states doing their EI, and they're different, and another type of environmental policy act. There's international ones I can't discuss now, but locally there's tribal environmental policy acts, TEPAs, and I believe the Spokane have got one developed. So using models that better measure impact. We want cumulative, we want ecological. Lastly, in this state, there's a research lab funded in Corvallis by EPA to look at ecological risk assessment. They're scientists. It could take a long time because the null hypothesis means you can neither confirm nor deny causality. So we're all waiting, but on that. So, you know, part of waiting, and this is something we didn't talk about, and this is where racism and sustainability hit each other a lot, is a precautionary principle. So I would design the precautionary principle to say, if you think you're going to create irreparable damage to people of color, you stop and figure it out. You know, but they don't ask me that much. So.
Isabel Sheridan, I'm a member of City Club, and I have a question about strategy. I'm a very recent transplant here. I came here because of its sustainability. And I found when I came to my Northwest neighborhood with streetcar and wonderful walking neighborhoods, that there was also a lot of lethal stuff in my air. I think that's common ground with North Portland. There is here. So I have a question for you about what we can do in our communities in North Portland and in Northwest Portland, and actually, I think in other sections of Portland as well. How can economic justice activists strategize to reverse the last administration in Washington's 2004-2005 changing the federal designation of some heavy metals from being dangerous to being merely toxic? We are seeing spikes in chromium-6, manganese, other very bad things in our neighborhood, and it's going on in North Portland too. What can we do? Who do we go to get this to happen, to change it?
Well, you're talking to some people right now, but the on that, usually it would be someone in Region 10 that would do environmental justice, but that person there has been censured and now recently uncensured, and is just spread between Seattle and Seattle. So, you know, there's no real guidance coming out of the feds on this. The other issues that you talked about, just 2 days ago, Administrator Jackson, who is appointed to the EPA and drove her mother out of the 9th Ward the day before it occurs, had developed a whole new set of public involvement rules for hazardous materials going into vulnerable communities. So she is picking up the slack on some of that. But there is no one place or space. There's a void between many of the issues that you talk about. And because we're in Salem and may not, we're not actually part of the Portland community and part of EJ, excuse me, is that they speak for themselves. These communities speak for themselves. So try to hearing the voices in the Highland Church, for example, and going into where those communities have trusted forums and sharing places and spaces, not invite to me all the time. Attorney General Kroger and I have this sort of open invitation, but I say to where I am, and he says to where he is. And so, and I like that right now. But for environmental justice purposes, that there's some state agency, perhaps designated people, but if you go on scorecard.org, find the emitter.
Also, while you're online, please visit the Governor's Natural Resource page and look at what the work of the Environmental Justice Task Force is. You will find there a statement called Your Voice, and that statement is your voice in public participation for environmental decisions. And we go through point by point what every member of the community has a right to do, to say, where to be. And our plan for the next year as a task force is to help communities organize and develop their voice in environmental participation, environmental decision-making. So I hope you'll be part of that. Now, if I could add one other thing, because I know in this audience there will be many members of the foundation community, both on the giving side and those who receive money from foundations. And one of the things that we have really struggled with is finding money for community groups to maintain themselves, to stay there, and to help participate and do the work that we need to have done. I am deeply grateful for the money that foundations give, but I certainly hope those of you in foundations will consider giving more money to community-based organizations that allow them to organize and to be there, not just for specific campaigns.
And yes. Thank you. I just wanted to add one point. Share your monitoring. Any measurement of environmental impact, despite our fights with each other, and you can call someone a judge or a neighbor, but we have fights, but share all your environmental information. A good quick source is to look at any draft environmental impact statements on anything, but it's going to be a highway probably in your area. And that will show all the other groups that considered options that were not decided on. So that information will help, and that will have other impact measurements that you don't have to do again.
Matteo Lucio, City Club member. You began your presentation by pointing out the extremely high correlation between toxic dumping, to use a shorthand, and race, which in this context, I presume you mean the very high percentage of minorities in a certain area. In other words,
right.
De facto housing segregation. So my question, which I realize is a little bit maybe perhaps outside your expertise, but is why do we still have such housing segregation in this country? To what extent is it economic factors like employment or housing prices? To what extent is it outright discrimination like redlining? And to what extent is it choices by people to cluster by race?
Mm-hmm. That's a very excellent question, and a lot of us in environmental justice, like Bob Bullard, come at this through housing discrimination issues. And what happens with housing discrimination is that one study, Atlanta Constitution study, comes quickly to mind, where African Americans with middle to high incomes were discriminated more than low-income whites with no observable credit history in terms of housing purchases. So it might be real estate agents steer people towards certain communities, and that's a no-no and all that, but the remedies are very hard to enforce with that. There's been a significant movement in the Obama administration about environmental justice in housing. So at some point, there's an argument inherent in your discussion of people coming to the nuisance that they're poor, and so they choose the most they can afford, which is hazardous. And so that's a controversy in the literature. And in some places, they just live near to work. Now, I want to quickly share this story about that statistics I gave you and why that is. It's slavery. And what happened, and remember, Martin Luther King died in a garbage man strike. And the garbage man was a respected middle-class position in many African-American communities. And when slavery ended, the garbage man would pick up the garbage, and then the states required them to become regulated landfills. And so what was de facto discrimination post-slavery became the 1 in 10,000 chance of being random. So it's de facto with that. Your other housing issues, I've just been told I'm out of time, but that's a driving dynamic. Those are good questions, and there are different answers for every community as to who put who where. But, I mean, do hold that question. That's a good question.
Well, we've run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for this week. Please join us on January 29th for a discussion about the intersection of immigration, labor, and food. And as we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's speakers, Robin Morris Collin and Robert William Collins. We're adjourned.